First of all, thank you very, very much for purchasing the Scorned Cut Away Dress known as Evelyn. It took me a really, really long time to figure out all the math and how to make this work, which brings me to please do not stray from the recommended fabrics. That is, for the main body of fabric, you want a two-way stretch only. So if you were looking at it on an axis, it would pull one way but not the other. And then for the accent fabric, you can use any light to medium woven. So like lace, organza, chiffon. So you could go with like a silk or a satin if you wanted. It's not too picky. Just don't get a stretch material for that one, because when you sew it on the bias, you don't want stretch going the other way. All of the pattern pieces are face up when they're printed, so that'll be the side that you want to have on the right side of your fabric. If you want to do the shoulder on the other side, all you got to do is flip all of the pieces. First, we're going to take the back panel and the front side panel, and we're going to line them up along the side seam. Make sure that when you do this, you put right sides together, otherwise known as the outside finished part of your garment. Now clip or pin along the side seam. Keeping in mind the 1/4 inch seam allowance, or 6 millimeters, sew along where you have clipped or pinned using a single needle and a stitch length roughly 2.5 to 3 millimeters. Here's how to not do what I did. I took off all of the pattern pieces from my cut panels early, and then I wasn't sure exactly which side was up. So right here, what I'm doing is I'm placing the pieces, like the panels that we just sewed together, opposite the panels that I haven't sewn yet, to be doubly sure exactly which side was the right side. By all means, be extra careful and do what I've done, but if you just don't take all of the pattern pieces off of your cut panels, you can be sure to know which ones are which. For this portion, we want both wrong sides pointing upward so that we're looking at the wrong side of each panel, and you're going to take your accent fabric for the cutaway and match it up with the front panel. Pinch both sides of the accent cutaway part and the main fabric. Pinch them and pull them up and clip or pin along that edge. Once again, keeping in mind our 1/4 inch seam allowance, having not changed our stitch length or anything else, we're going to sew along the length of this seam. My personal preference, that you can do with as you choose, is to have my non-stretch material on the top and my stretch material on the bottom. My presser foot is going to stretch out or try to stretch out my fabric, while the feed dogs are going to pull along underneath. I find that this way gives me the least amount of trouble. Once again, we're going to lay everything out wrong sides facing upwards so that we can really get at and see all of our seams. The other side of the cutaway is going to line up with the front side panel and the back panel that we have previously sewn together. Your side seam should come roughly halfway down the cutaway. I personally prefer, especially when working along curves, to work from the center towards both ends, but this is just my personal preference. Once again, pinch upwards so that the seam will be facing towards you on the wrong side, and clip or pin along the whole seam where the body matches with the cutaway. Once again, keeping in mind our 1/4 inch seam allowance, we're going to sew along the length of where we have clipped or pinned. Congratulations, you're done the hard part. Now that we've got the cutaway sewn to both sides of the body, what we need to do is top stitch. So what you do is you turn both sides of your 1/4 inch seam allowance underneath and then top stitch from the right side over top, catching the layers so that it folds the seam allowance back in underneath the body to keep it invisible. Do this to both sides. Our seam allowance is only 1/4 inch, so you're going to have to stay reasonably close to the cutaway. I recommend 1/8 inch or 3 millimeters. Now, working from the right side of our front panel, we're going to take the long little rectangular panel and we're going to align it with the line that is marked on the front pattern piece. This part is where the pattern turns into more guidelines than actual rules. Wherever you want to put the slit up the front is up to you. I like it roughly 1/3 of the width of the garment over to one side, and I also like it about 17.5 inches. I've marked that up to 20 inches, but really it's up to you if you want to make it 10 inches, if you want to make it less. The only thing I can say is don't neglect to put it in there, otherwise you'll need to sew the bottom differently for a stretch material material so that it stretches when when you walk. Otherwise, it's not going to work at all and you're going to end up walking like Morticia with really tiny little steps. Now sew one continuous stitch through both of these panels all the way up, stopping at the top, turning around and going back down towards the bottom, leaving just enough space in between both stitch lines to easily cut through with scissors. If you've never done this before, I recommend that you mark a line. Now consider that you will never see this line, so mark it with whatever you want as long as it's not a ridiculously liquid Sharpie marker that's going to bleed really bad. I personally prefer white, pencil crayons, or even a pen is just fine. But mark your line dead center, and then when you're sewing, just make sure that you sew just to one side and then the other of this line. It's very, very helpful. When sewing this, leave roughly the same amount of seam allowance that you would have along the sides at the top. Now, using a really sharp pair of scissors, cut in between the stitch lines all the way from the bottom to the top, stopping just before where you turned around. Now we're going to turn all of the seam allowances over to the wrong side. I find it easiest to start at the top and work my way down to the bottom along each side. If you notice any puckering at the top, it may mean that you need to go back and cut just tiniest bit closer to your stitch line. It's surprising how close you can get, but if you haven't done this before, do it in small increments so that you don't cut too far. This is also just personal preference, but anytime I'm doing this, as I progress down each side, I like to turn the seam that I'm hiding in just ever so slightly so that it's not going to be seen from the outside as easily. Now that we have it clipped or pinned, we're going to sew, traveling along almost the exact same path that we did to make this in the first place. We're going to start at the bottom, go up one side, turn, and go back down the other, staying as close as we can to the already sewn seam that we're hiding. I recommend roughly 1/8 of an inch. It's finally time to close up our dress. We're getting so close. Start by lining up the side seam that's left, marrying the two right sides of both front and back body panels. Pin or clip all the way down. Once again, keeping in mind our 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew along the length of the seam that we have just pinned or clipped. Now it's time to close up the shoulder, marrying both right sides of our front and back, pin or clip along the shoulder seam. Using the same 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew along the top of the shoulder where we have pinned or clipped. We almost have a wearable dress. This is exciting. It's time to hem the bottom. Now, the bottom should have a slightly larger hem than the rest of our regular seam allowance. I used a roughly 1/2 inch or maybe around 12 millimeters. It's really up to you if you want to bring it up a fair bit, or if you want to make it like 3/8 of an inch or even less. You could go 1/4 inch. I really like a larger one because I just think it gives the garment better drape. Turn the bottom of the dress towards the wrong side, or what will be the inside of our finished garment, by your chosen amount, and then pin or clip in place. Because I hate bulky corners, what I'm doing here is I'm actually starting slightly up one of the sides of the slit in the dress, and I'm working my way down towards the bottom hem of the dress, and then I turn and go along the bottom to continue my hem. I do this because it's just easier, and I think it looks better and it creates less hassle as far as running the machine. You can do whatever you want, but I recommend this way. Because we're stitching along the hem in the exact same direction as the fabric is meant to stretch, a roller foot is very helpful for this portion of it. You can also adjust the presser foot pressure of your machine to as light as possible. To finish off, do the exact same thing, only opposite of when we started. Stop at the corner of the slit in the dress, and then turn and go partially up the slit before stopping. Now we need to finish the openings at the top. I'm sticking with my 1/4 inch seam allowance due to the fact that these have some stretch along them, and I don't exactly want to mess with that. So I'm going to turn under the edges of both open sides, one being my arm and the other one being for my arm, shoulder, and head. I'm going to turn these under, and then I'm going to pin or clip them in place. Keeping in mind that we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance on these, stick pretty close to the edge. I recommend the same thing that we did for the cutaway, roughly 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters. I don't like to start and stop on seam points because I find that the bulk makes it hard for my machine to start its stitch. So I recommend that you favor the back and you start just a couple inches away from your seam so that you can use that as a turn point instead of a start-stop. All right, that's it. I mean, if you want to do embellishments or anything else after the fact, you can, but now you can wear this, go out and be super duper fancy. Oh my god, we finished it. Isn't it awesome? I love mine. It has never failed to get a bazillion and one compliments, and I feel like $1,000,000 every time I go wear it out. So you go rock it.